Hi, everyone. I'm Jaidin with Jasper Consultancy, and I am here today doing an executive series with Matthew Cahill of Percipio Company. He specializes in disrupting biases that impact our company's performance, and I'm really looking forward to him taking our minds on a journey from bias to belonging through our conversation today around DE&I, specifically around separating DE&I, because I know they're all grouped together in one acronym and very much related, but actually have very different approaches in terms of approach and strategy and execution. So, welcome, Matthew. I'm very excited to learn from you today.
Ooh, thank you, Jaden. It's a pleasure to be here and your inaugural podcasting guest.
I love it. I love it. Let's talk, because we're talking about separating DE and I want to start off by saying, why is it that we should look at these separately and not be just grouping them together?
Because they're distinctly different things. And when you conflate them together, it's usually done in such a way that it's referring to something that none of them are singularly, and they cannot be because there isn't a collective something. So I think it's more often than not, especially in the last year and a half or so, DEI and its conflating of those letters together and then referring to it as something, it's being done intentionally to blame it for something that it's incapable of doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we lose that individuality of each piece. And we need each piece, right? Each component is so distinct and so important. I really love what you had to say on LinkedIn about we're grouping them together like insurance bundles when they are distinct and separate things. So let's dive into.
Oh, that's a beautiful metaphor because I just thought it when you repeated it, like whenever you bundle something together, like Allstate bundles insurance products, you do it so you can discount it, right? And just by putting them all together into one lump, you're discounting it. So you're doing each of them a disservice when you lump them all together. I love that. I hadn't even thought about that.
You came up with it. I love it. It's a beautiful representation, I think, of what is happening. So let's kind of go through each one separately so we can really give it the time and the attention that each one deserves. And start off with diversity, right? I think a lot of companies, and I've seen a lot of companies come to me and say, hey, we need X or we need Y. We need to improve our diversity hiring by X%. And you had a great question. I would love for you to kind of take it here, but you ask a great question right off the bat that I'm totally stealing from you from now on to really assess how that DEI process and build out is going to go. Do you mind telling our audience what that is?
Yeah, and I'll give a little historical context as well, because uh I'm old enough to remember when diversity was a word that started getting more traction in the corporate workplaces. And I'm just gonna, kind of spitball a time frame. Let's call it, be generous and say it was like in the late 70s or early 80s when diversity was introduced into the corporate lexicon as something that needed to be tolerated. We need to tolerate diversity was kind of the corporate status quo. That was the memo. That was the messaging. And now when you step back from that and think about that era, right? Like this is a very, very white male dominated corporate space. More and more and more women are kind of working their way into that space. And so that's the diversity metric that you're talking about, or that was being referred to then is a gender diversity. And you think about that, that makes sense. We did tolerate diversity. Women were tolerated at that time. And you tolerate a rash, right? You tolerate something that you just want it to go away. And so I think, we've come a long way since then, where it's not immediately associated that way, and you have different words that are described, but it was realized pretty early on that diversity wasn't much without inclusion. So you had D and I, right? The early iterations were D and I, diversity and inclusion. And then we can talk a little bit about equity in a minute. But I think diversity, it goes way beyond gender. Diversity goes way beyond race. It goes way beyond culture. It goes way beyond age. It goes way beyond orientation. And simultaneously, it's all of those things. And so the moment that you start pigeonholing diversity into one dimension of diversity, you're limiting it to what it could potentially be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And with that quote, when you come in and someone says, hey, I need more diversity, what is it that you always ask? I love this question so much. I want for others to be able to hear it because it's so vital.
Yeah, this is a leading question that I include with all of my coaching, executive coaching specifically, executive coaching, leadership coaching. One of the grounding questions I consistently use is, do you see diversity as a fundamental strength for your business, or is it a problem that needs to be fixed? And you got to just let it hang there for a minute, let it sink in. And I've seen people recoil from that question and bristle at that question. And I've heard responses that range from like, well, I don't like the way that you framed that question. Or there's lots of different reactions that people have initially. And it's a very telling question because you can start to build how you're going to engage with that person and potentially that organization based off of the response from that one question.
Absolutely. And I think it makes a huge, huge difference. When you said it, the light bulb above my head just exploded. I love that because frequently in talent acquisition and, executive search, we see, hey, you can't say it, but they do, right? We need a female in this role, right? We need a female leader. We don't have any, or maybe we have 1 out of 10. And knowing, hey, do you need a female leader? Or do you need a diverse perspective, right? Is it a metric that you're going for to look okay? Or is it really understanding the strengths that different backgrounds bring, right? They build your culture, they boost your productivity, your engagement, your retention, they help you problem solve. There's so many benefits that diversity brings to the table. And I think when you can diagnose and say, hey, is this leader looking for a number? Or are they really looking to add strength to their team and build organizational success through diversity? It's critical to have that perspective. And I think a lot of leaders don't.
Yeah, and that question is just one of many that you need to ask early and often to get a better sense of where what the real need is.
Absolutely. Do you have any other questions around diversity that you dive in and ask specifically?
Um, None that are popping to mind. Those I usually, I mean, that's one easy go-to question. The remainder of the questions that I build to do the initial round of discovery, whether it be a coaching engagement or an overall executive team engagement, or whether it be a board of directors, or if it's more of a collective effort, I'm going to stitch together a series of questions. The other ones, are really framed more, if it's in an HR context, like you had said about talent acquisition. I think it's really important to remind people right out of the gate that you're never, ever, ever hiring for a single category or a single, criteria. If you're hiring somebody just because they're blank, it's likely going to be a mistake. So as a hiring manager, I would hope that no one ever, ever, ever is hiring just because that person is Black, or just because that person is a white male, or just because that person is a Latin female. Like, I think that criteria can be sought out, right? Legally, maybe you can't say it, as you were alluding to, but you can internally seek that out and have that be one of many criteria that you believe that the person who's going into this role is best suited, right? And then you're doing justice to that person in that role, right? And the example I like to use, I think a Black female CPA, a Black female chief financial officer has an inordinately more challenging job than a white male CPA or chief financial officer. just in general, all other things considered, just those two differences, right? And if you in your financial officer role believe that role is going to be stronger because you have a Black female in it, then by all means, right? Like let's prioritize that. Let's weight that more. But I'm not going to hire somebody with inferior accounting skills just because they're X, Y, or Z or fulfilling some other criteria.
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing we also overlook, just, because I'm on that talent acquisition side and that HR side of the house, right? And HR, I feel like, and correct me, HR community, if I'm wrong, but at least from my experience, there are certain things at HR that right? You recognize the value of diversity and what it does. We have the data to prove it, right? We use data in everything, sales, marketing, right? We improve our teams through it. We track engagement and retention and performance and the social sciences of, hey, when we invest in our team members, when we increase diversity, all of these things follow suit. And the data is there to show how it boosts overall organizational success. So I feel like as HR, we're like, yes, we understand the value. We absolutely want and need this. But a lot of leaders, they don't have HR backgrounds. They don't have the talent acquisition backgrounds, right? They may be really amazing software engineers that just don't have the background. And it's not that, I just say they just don't have the knowledge to know why diversity is so important. So when they just get the metric, they're like, hey, I'm hiring for this role. This is the metric I have to hit. And so really, if I get anything out of this today, it's that, hey, leaders, I promise you, it's not about a metric. It is about the overall organizational success that diversity brings to the table. I know you specialize in bias, Matthew. What are some biases that you constantly see with regarding diversity and how people can overcome them?
Well, the easy low-hanging fruit is like me bias, is sometimes called similarity bias, affinity bias. Those terms I use interchangeably for the most part. It's something that we all have. It's our natural tendency to gravitate towards people who are like us. And you can map out over the trajectory of most lifetimes, your relationships revolve around different dimensions of your identity. And when you're single, you're around single people. When you're in couples, you're around other couples. When you're have kids, when you have kids, you abandon your friends and everything that you had up to that point, and then everything revolves around your children going forward. That's an exaggeration, but there is some truth to it. And so I think there's such gravity and weight towards that type of bias, right? Some people extrapolate it out to a social context and say, if you want evidence of like me bias, just go to any place of worship on Sunday morning, and you'll see usually people congregating around a form of like me bias. And whether that be like values, usually it's, there's some religious context to it, but more often than not, it's also very homogenous. Like every community is also very homogenous. So it's a very powerful social bonding, organizing mechanism that gets undervalued or in a hiring context. And I think it's a big contributing factor towards homogenous workforces.
I completely agree. This is actually something I didn't expect to talk about, but something that I actually actively do. And I use the predictive index. I'm not paid to say that, I promise, not being promoted by the predictive index, but shout out. And I never thought about it in this context, but when I go in to do an executive search, a lot of the times they'll say, hey, we're having difficulty, right? Either attracting or retaining the right person for this role. And I'll go in and we'll use the predictive index to assess their current team and say, hey, it puts them in 4 different quadrants typically, right? We're gonna look like this. And I'll say, hey, your team is all over here, right? They all have these specific qualities, but your goals and what you need to accomplish are over here, right? You don't have anyone to get you to point A to point B. Of course, you're frustrated, right? You don't have a leadership style or, those natural skills and abilities of those people because you're not hiring for them. And it's a good way that I've learned to say, hey, let's not rush to give an offer to someone you like the most, right? Because you clearly have a natural hiring tendency over here. But instead, let's work to find the traits of that person that will get you where you want to go. And then we can do some consulting around, the conversations to be had, the conflict resolution maybe that you'll have. And I think it really sheds light and provides that to those CEOs or, that VP of engineering hiring for director, whoever it might be, instead of coming to them and just saying, hey, trust my subject matter expertise. You're hiring the wrong people based on your biases, your like me bias. I can now show them data and say, hey, actually, this is what's happening, and let's try to avoid that.
Yeah, that can be a sticky conversation. It can be a thorny conversation. If people are wedded to the founders all went to Stanford, right? Now we want to go back to Stanford. And then we scratch our heads going, why can't we find any talent? Why can't we find anybody? Like there's lots of manifestations of it. And I think it's something that we also have to be mindful of the nuance that's there, because there's some compelling evidence that shows when companies are small, especially in startup mode, that a certain degree of like me bias is actually a strength. Because a byproduct of like me bias is like implicit trust. You trust people who look like you, who sound like you, who talk like you, have the same values. Like there's just implicit trust there. And when you're starting a business, you gotta have that. Like implicit trust is paramount. And homogenous groups have that. It's easier for homogenous groups to have that than it is for diverse groups. Diversity requires time. Diversity requires people more effort. It just does. It requires you to think a little differently, to perhaps stretch yourself a little bit, to get yourself out of your comfort zone, and be willing to explore, even if it's just a diverse point of view, right? Let alone a whole history and experience that may be very different than your own. So I think it's a trade-off. Startups, they benefit from that same type of bias. The catch is it's temporary. I mean, the data you're referring to shows that over time, diverse teams outperform those that are not. And so startups go through a very predictable trend where they get to a point where the same skill sets that got them there aren't going to get them any farther. And that's where diversity really comes into play.
I love that. I absolutely love that. I worked with seed stage, Series A, all the way through Fortune 500. And I would definitely say it's so important within those seed stage and Series A's. The final interview is actually just an in-person interview where they grab dinner and say, hey, is this a person that I would want to grab a beer with? Because we're going to be spending a lot of time together in strategic planning sessions and build outs, right? Even if it's remote, they get together often to hash stuff out. And so can I have conflict with this person and it be healthy conflict, right? Do I trust that when I have conflict, they're coming from the best place and they still know what they're talking about? All of these factors go into play. And so knowing which one is the most important, right? I probably wouldn't do a predictive index for a seed stage company. I will if they want. However, their capital is probably better spent earlier on in a different way. But I do really love just that it's ever changing. But we want leaders to know when is the time to make that change, and how can you assess, okay, it's time to make that change, and this is the change that we need to make. Because I think that also helps either boost companies through organizational success or starts tearing them down and holding them back.
Yeah, the conversation needs to land on, it's not a question of if you need to diversify, it's a question of when.
Yeah, absolutely. And then who owns that, right? Who's out there assessing for it, looking for it, knowing that, whose job is that, especially in a startup that's growing rapidly? Whose time is allocated towards that?
Well, yeah, then it's maybe let's get in a fractional HR company. We need a HR consulting service, or we need to hire a fractional HR person, or it's funny that we're even saying this along that kind of timeline, because many companies don't even consider HR until it's too late, until they have problems that need to be fixed. And it really is just a, it's a reflection of the values of business. And that's a whole nother bigger picture story and trend. But, the companies that value their humans sooner than later are going to outperform those that don't.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Amen. I have been preaching this. It's what my company is founded on, is that people first strategic approach. And how can we better your people? Because when it comes down to it, everyone says the business always wins out over the people, but the people are your business. They are your business. So why is this the case? Why is it a common saying? I do not know. Wonderful. Well, I want to make sure we have time for all three, right? They do equally deserve time. Let's go into equity, because this is a piece I feel like as the middle of the acronym gets overlooked a lot. And I think when we talk about diversity, companies commonly say, hey, we need to have X amount of diverse people per our population, per the general population. And they check that box and they're like, great, we're doing that on the hiring side. We're done. Even though there's way more to it. And I think with equity, I've seen a lot of pay equity conversations, right? Pay bands. And these are amazing and they're important. But we can't just have diversity hiring metrics and post pay bands so everyone has equal pay and check out and call it a day, right? There's so much more that goes into internal equity. And I would love to hear your thoughts on all of them.
So let me just first say that I think we've already started defining inclusion. It was coming out of what we were just describing as a byproduct of diversity. And I think the timeline supports that. Like going back to the tolerate diversity comment, it became very apparent that we needed to get, if companies were not being inclusive, then whatever diverse talent was there left. And so there was a natural marriage between D and I, and that was really a commonly held expression. And I think equity was born out of D and I. And once you get an organizational shift, I mean, a mindset shift from the executives into organizational processes and protocols and governance, right? And this is all areas of institutionalized biases. Processes, protocols, governance. This is how bias gets baked into the company. And I think that equity, the whole notion of equity, was born out of diversity and inclusion. And I'll say it's not a coincidence. It is all of those things that you described a moment ago, but it's not a coincidence that equity is the same term that's used for ownership. Equity is the same term that's used for ownership of a company, and that is true equity, right? The narrative, the storyline of a mass of people like laboring, even the labor model in the industrial age is built on a lot of people toiling away to make a very few set of people a lot of money. And that's the basis for our business model, right? Like it and that model, I think, is starting to wear out its welcome. And there is a rise in the number of ESOPs, right? Employee stock owned programs. There is a rise in the number of businesses and B Corps that really codify into their governance equitable measures. And those types of companies, I think, are going to continue to grow and expand.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, really quickly, when we refer to equity, right? Because there is that equity component in terms of stock options and RVUs, but there's and pay equity. But I also want to talk about the equal opportunities for individuals from all backgrounds, addressing systemic barriers, ensuring everyone has a fair chance to succeed, and that point of view of equity within the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's usually the table stakes. I mean, that's the starting points for conversations around equity, is usually around access and accessibility. And that could be getting a seat at a table. That could be, restructuring the workday. That could be giving people ergonomic chairs. I mean, there's lots of different manifestations of equity as it relates to accessibility.
Absolutely. And I think, inclusion, and the reason I left this for the last part is because inclusion, I do feel like, is really what ties it into that acronym that it is today, right? Because you can have equity, as a separate, you can have diversity separated, and then inclusion feeds in both, right? You need, and we talked a little bit about the tie between diversity and inclusion, but equity and inclusion as well, right? If everyone has a fair chance to succeed, equal opportunity for resources, how do you tie all of those together? And so I really want to, dive into an inclusive workplace culture, right? I think people need to feel valued and welcomed and equal across their diverse backgrounds, across their diverse cultures, their diverse races, whatever it may be. So let's dive in a little bit to inclusivity and how to foster a creative and innovative and productive inclusive workplace.
Um, I I think we as we've already sort of described inclusive behaviors in how we were describing diversity earlier, how we were describing equity, some of the examples of that. That's all stems from inclusive leadership. And I think there was a natural byproduct of DEI when it was being done correctly, uh, in that it gave birth to the B, right? The belonging. And so there was a brief stretch, I want to say like 2021, 2020, maybe 2022, and even in 2023, where DEI, it wasn't uncommon to hear the B immediately after it, DEI B. And these were companies that were really putting a concerted effort to foster a culture of belonging, where people feel like they belong. They're going to work for more than a paycheck. They're going to work because they feel a sense of purpose. They have a connection to the company vision. There's just a greater there's a sense of belonging. I mean, it's satisfying a fundamental human need that we all have, and that's to feel like we belong somewhere. And that's a core part of somebody's identity. It's a core part of their agency, having confidence in what they do and the role that they're in. And it's a sense that they feel psychologically safe, like there's not power barriers that they're going to smash into that are going to crush them.
That's a big one. Psychological safety is huge. I preach on it all the time. I think that B initially, right, was, hey, inclusion is, we respect the differences, right? We want everyone to be included. We respect everyone's different. And belonging was really, hey, we don't just respect, but we appreciate these differences, right? Come in, be yourself. And I think now the B's kind of gone away with. I don't hear it very often, but it's been wrapped into inclusion. And so inclusion no longer is just fostering environments that we respect differences, but that we actually really appreciate them. And hopefully, right, that as we went away with the B, that feeling that the belonging brought didn't go away with it. It's just a letter.
Well, I mean, I still maintain that belonging is an incredible aspirational goal for inclusive leaders to organize their company around. I think belonging, as a byproduct of DEI, was there wasn't a lot of initiatives or programs that were put in place to try to measure belonging. So that was the second assessment that I created from the Percipio Company perspective, which is to create a way to measure belonging, right? Like this goes back to your love of data, right? We love to measure stuff. And when you say belonging, that could be so transient. Like maybe I just woke up and I stubbed my toe and now I'm angry. And so I go to work and I'm angry and I don't feel like I belong there. it's not that's not a fair assessment for belonging as a a company metric. And so the Percipio Company, we have a belonging assessment that companies use, and I've used it successfully with a number of companies to give them a way to really move the needle when it comes to employees feeling like they belong.
I'm gonna have to definitely use you and recommend you over for that, because that is a huge one that I think is so difficult to track. So, how do you suggest that leaders make an active step toward fostering belonging within their organizations?
Well, my bias is for the four cornerstones of belonging as I've defined them. And it starts with identity. It moves into agency, right? Identity is who you are. Agency is who you are at work, right? So it's the combination and that intersection of you in your role, right? So Jaidin, as an owner of a business, you're a woman-owned business. Like you are an entrepreneur, and yet there's so many things that are wrapped up with that. But if you don't feel like you're in the right role, then your degree of agency is never going to go anywhere. I mean, it's setting yourself up for misery. And so identity, agency, the third cornerstone is the one that most companies unconsciously avoid. And it's the naming of power. And power within an organization isn't always who makes the most money. It isn't always held in a title. Power within an organization is much more elusive than that. And I think it's benefits everybody to have a deeper understanding of who has the power and what are they doing with it. And then the fourth cornerstone of belonging is flow. And that's a blatant take on Michaela Csikszentmihalyi's seminal work on flow in the workplace. And so flow, that his concepts have been used in the NBA, in the NFL, in professional sports contexts, but it's that sense of being in the zone. Like you are doing what you do because you love what you do and you're in the right role. It's calibrated for the degree of tension versus the challenge versus your ability to get things done. Like it's all of those things. When the stars align, we have high states of flow in the organization.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that is ultimately, I mean, mine and Jasper Consultancy's goal and our mission, right, is to enhance the structures and the makeup of organizations so that we can get employees to that flow state, right, where they're performing better, they're more productive, and you're getting that maximum productivity out of them that drives that organizational success. But through the really great people first and people centric approaches, right, when people are happy, loving what they do, excited to come to work, so you're getting the best out of them. And moving toward those and advocating for those healthy structures rather than some of the unhealthy structures that we have seen throughout history.
That's right. That's right. We got to get rid of toxic environments, one workplace at a time.
Well, between me and you, hopefully we're making a pretty good dent, and we'll continue to make an even bigger dent. I know there's a ton of other amazing leaders out there looking forward to making dents and changing that status quo of the way things are currently done. And so thank you so much, Matthew. This has been so enlightening. I've learned so much. I hope that you all have learned so much. It's been such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Jaidin. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Have a great rest of your day.